So the last three talks or lectures covered one way of describing the evolution of our experience through this process of realization, this evolution or de-evolution of our identity into true nature. In this talk, I will address practical matters, practical considerations regarding engaging the process itself, engaging the moment itself, and how best to intelligently and authentically allow this natural process to unfold. There are, roughly speaking, two aspects to this engagement, to practice. One is the surrendered aspect, we could maybe say the feminine aspect, not referring to gender specifically, but the reference is more to knowing that the intimacy of aliveness, the simple and clear giving oneself over to the momentary call to inhabit your life. The other side of things is the intention side, the side that recognizes that although we do intuit that we were never apart from our true nature, that Buddha nature is here and now and could never not be. If we're honest with ourselves, we don't always live in accord with that. And the side effect of that, or let's say the indicator of that, is suffering. And so this compels us to dig in, to do some work, to actively question, to practice. And I think that a balance of these two modes of approaching realization is critical. There are ways of teaching, teaching styles, groups of people, traditions, etc., that overemphasize one or the other of those aspects, and I think that can be a hindrance. Also, any one of us, any individual, at certain times in this process will tend toward one or the other of those sides. I find that as the realization clarifies more and more, as we become more acutely and actively attuned to the subtle, we recognize naturally that there really is a middle way with this. There's a critical balance between, as Adyashanti might call it, between will and willingness. And that balance is very natural. So I thought that maybe I'll just divide this talk into discussion of those two approaches, or those two parts of our engagement of the Dharma, or the realization process. First, being the surrendered aspect. That is the recognizing that our true nature, that undivided reality, is here always. It's now. We don't have to find it. We don't have to go out. We can't go out and find it somewhere else. We certainly don't have to construct it. That's not going to work. And that the acknowledgement that we're always in contact with it. So how do we work with this? How do we practice the unpracticable? I think that probably the most salient way of describing this is actually the one commonality among this and the sort of opposite way of approaching realization, the intention aspect. There is one commonality, and that is that we have a commitment to truth at the heart level and even the instinctual gut level, that we're willing to do some work. We're also willing to surrender, and we're willing to admit we don't always know when to do which, or even know the nature of either of those ways of being. But that's not the how. The how not is not as important as the attunement to living truth. This could almost be called a prayer, and sometimes it is formulated as a prayer. And in one way of speaking, when you pray for something, an outcome, peace, etc., you're probably praying to yourself or maybe your own ego. When you pray for unfiltered reality, for unconditioned truth, you're praying to a very powerful force indeed, a force that is beyond you, and you know that. It's beyond you, not necessarily in time or space, but in subtlety. We have someone else who wants to join the talk. Come on, baby girl. Come on. You gotta come up. Come on, good girl. There we go. Cleo's here. Let's see. Can you see her? There's Cleo. Okay. You're engaging something that is beyond you in subtlety, in potency. And to pray in this way, to make this sort of intention, you have to make it from a place of knowing this, of acknowledging this. You have to take the ego, the self-interest, off the pedestal long enough to make this kind of surrendered acknowledgement to the universe. But it's very powerful. It's a very powerful thing to do. That is, ultimately, all I really am interested in is what is true. What is true in the absolute and true in the relative, and where they meet. You can call that enlightenment. You can call that liberation. That's what I'm interested in. But I'm willing to admit that liberation might not look like anything I can think it looks like from my limited perspective, my limited point of view. And I'm willing for that limited point of view to fall away in this process, knowing that it probably will to some degree that I can't predict now. This is a powerful, powerful prayer. You don't want to say it unless you mean it, but I'm not sure you can say it unless you mean it. As this plays out in a practical sense, day to day, this surrendered approach, the surrendered aspect, it's something like openness. As you go about your day, as you're walking, talking, sitting, thinking, eating, hugging, kissing, working, let some part of yourself be open. Your heart, your mind, your instinct, your attention, open to some possibility that is beyond your limited scope, your limited apparatus for knowing, your limited view. Be willing to let something beyond that touch you, come to you, make itself, or make the truth known in a moment of clarity, a moment of aha. Be willing to be surprised. Be willing to be in awe. Be willing to admit you don't know. You might know a lot about the relative world. You know about facts, figures, processes. In the relative sense, of course, you know a lot of things, a lot of information. But when it comes to who or what you are, you can't know in the usual sense. So when you turn toward who or what you are, a mystery opens up immediately if you do it without thinking about it. You're immediately confronted with an unknowing, an unbinding. And it's paradoxical because there's something there that is very, very clear, very settled and satisfied already, that it is just this way, which is no specific way. And yet, in every way that we can know ourselves, that we can talk about ourselves, talk to ourselves, communicate to another about who or what we are or how life really is, all of those are pretty much obliterated as soon as we turn to the mystery of being right now. It is an act of sublime surrender. So being willing to make that turn when it comes to you to do so, when you think about it, or something comes to you, some sensation or experience of openness, clarity, being willing to turn and let it open you. This is good practice. This is powerful engagement of that commitment to the Dharma, to truth. And as the mind calms down more and more, that opening is really more and more to the senses themselves, to the mystery of sound, the mystery of sensation, body sense, the mystery of what's right in front of your eyes. Being open to that means don't fool yourself that you know about that you know about it in a practical way, or that you know about it in a spiritual way, especially a spiritual way. To be open in this way, we really have to leave behind our spiritual knowledge, our spiritual collection of experiences, our background, how hard we worked or struggled, or how much we've let go of already. All of that is irrelevant. Because what's right in front of your face is unconditioned, unbound by any narratives, any knowing. Any context. So allow yourself to be opened by that. And it's found here in this talk. It's found walking your dog. It's found in the sidewalk, in the tree, in the nest, in the sky. Don't make distinctions. Don't believe the thoughts that say that you know the difference between the mundane and the divine, the spiritual and the unspiritual, the good and the bad. Those are just thoughts. We all have those thoughts. They're stereotyped, they're conditioned, they're fine, but they're not actually telling you what's right in front of your face. They're giving you an interpretation of what's right in front of your face. So in one way of speaking, the storyline of spiritual seeking is really just a little trick of the mind to say that it's later. That I've been working on this for a long time and it hasn't happened yet. And Dogen has a quote. I think he says, ready is already too late. Ready is too late. Can't be ready for this. You'll never be ready for this. But you don't have to be ready for it. That's the beauty of it. It's not about you. It's doesn't exclude you, but it's not so concerned with the limitations of your perception. Only you are concerned with the limitations of your perception, right? Or only the mind really is concerned with its own perceptual model that it overlays over actual reality. It has its practical purposes, sure. But don't believe the overlay. Another, I think, helpful or important aspect to this practiceless practice of surrender is natural meditation, especially when it kind of clicks or dawns on you, as it did for me several years ago. During meditation, something just clicked differently, and there was no longer any sense of a meditator, is one way of saying it. But it was also clear that there's never a need for a technique. It doesn't mean that there's no use for a technique. On occasion, there will be use for techniques. When working with equanimity, when working with the non-dual, the perceptual filters that create the illusion of duality, there's some contemplations that can be helpful. Engaging the senses in a certain way, certain inquiries. But as far as meditation itself is concerned, it's not a technique, and that's exquisitely obvious. It's just full willingness to experience everything exactly as it is right now. Nothing more than that. So knowing wherever attention moves, whatever thought arises, whatever sensation there is, whether it seems to be moving quickly or slowly, whether it's soft or hard or contracted or relaxed or expanded, doesn't matter. We don't make a problem of whatever experience is in this moment. It's just what it is already. That is meditation. So meditation is when we essentially stop doing anything else other than perhaps noticing. But even that is saying a bit much. It's just this. It's a non-doing of the agendas of me, moving through time, thinking, acting upon, trying to make my experience better, trying to decide what's important and what's not important, or what's more or less important. All of that, when you stop doing it, that is natural meditation. And I think that's a valuable practice. And there's a very personal aspect to this surrendered approach. And that is work with the emotion body, with the personal experiences of being you. Willingness to just first acknowledge what you're feeling, the spectrum of emotions, grief, happiness, joy, expectation, impatience, frustration, disgust, and then the deeper emotions that will start to come to the surface, that are often quite repressed. Shame, guilt, resentment, and helplessness and the fear of helplessness, and existential fear, anger, and even rage. Being willing to notice that we all have propensity, well, maybe not a propensity, we all have a potential to experience these emotions, and a willingness to see when we are experiencing some version of those emotions, and also noticing how we repress them. When the parent voice comes in and says, oh, you shouldn't be feeling that, that's not appropriate, or which is sometimes the voice of fear as well, that, anger, that emotion will take you over. It could become dangerous. You shouldn't have that. Let's rationalize it, or look at the situation differently, etc. Willing to see that is a voice of repression, and be willing to feel, let the body acknowledge physically that emotion. Of course, I'm not saying to give yourself permission to act out on it in a violent way, but as I wrote in the book, we act out on emotions in violent ways when we repress them. And then they find an outlet sooner or later when we're unconscious. Better to acknowledge them, be open to them, see that they have a place in this whole of experience. And the more we do that, the more capacity that we realize we have for experience itself. That emotions really are energy in motion. They're physiologic responses to the environment. Really that, and nothing more. Part of why we repress emotions is we learned it. We learned it from our parents or from situations where we acted out in an unhealthy way or whatever. But part of why we repress emotions is the ego, the thought apparatus, the mind-identified part of ourselves doesn't prefer when we're overtaken by an emotion, because it's kind of rendered inert, or it becomes very obvious that it's always been inert. When we are taken over by, say, ecstasy, sexual energy, or when we're taken over by laughter, or we're overtaken by sadness or grief, the mind-identified part of us doesn't like that, because it's very obvious that the physiology of this body can very quickly and easily override the little story we tell ourselves about how in control we are. So there's also that reason, or that aspect to how we repress and why we repress emotions. But all of this will disentangle itself if you're just willing to feel. Keep feeling. So I think it's best not to overlook that part of realization. The emotion work is important. The shadow work is important. As far as the more directed practice side of things, I generally recommend doing things in a certain order, but everybody is different. Everybody wakes up in different ways, and so forth. However, there are reasonably reproducible patterns to it. And anyone who watches the videos or has read the book knows I generally orient people toward that first obvious shift in identity, that the shifting of identity itself, or what you take yourself to be, is critical. It tends to and almost no matter how you get to that, whether it's through self-inquiry, surrender, working directly with a teacher, emotion work, whatever it is, looking at beliefs again and again and again very carefully. However you arrive at that, it tends to have a very similar quality, but the key to it really is this undeniability. If anyone was listening to Q&A yesterday, talking to Kim, I asked her a few questions at the end, purposely really for everyone, just to demonstrate how intuitively obvious it is that knowing is more real than real. It's really undeniable, and that is the mark of that first very important shift, because before that we have so much self-doubt that you could almost say that the doubt mass itself, the shroud of doubt, is what makes it seemingly so hard to see that, as she answered the question that I asked last night, has there ever been a time when this wasn't there? And she immediately said, absolutely not. It's always here, with a very profound certainty. And that's really how it is with anyone who's gone through this, especially immediately after it. So I really do think it's quite important to orient toward that first shift, that to really dig into the nature of identity itself. Who am I? Is one very good way to do it. What is Mu? Working with a Zen teacher, perhaps, is another good way to do it. Just digging into beliefs in a sort of ruthless way, your own beliefs about yourself, especially. That's a really powerful way to do it. It might be challenging to do that on your own, but it's certainly possible. But working with a teacher, or working with somebody who's gone through this, who can help you dig in that way, that can be really potent. So again, there are various ways to go about this. But I like to quote my Zen teacher. I'm pretty sure I put this in the book, but I've heard him say this in a few different ways, but the most salient way he said it was that ultimately enlightenment or realization is about living out of the innermost promptings of your tender and loving heart. However, without awakening, without insight, you will think you're living out of the innermost promptings of your tender and loving heart, and you will be living out of the outermost promptings of your deluded ego. And that's a heavy statement, but it's true. It's very easy. The ego can co-opt anything. Think of how many, extreme examples, of course, but how many people in history have, in their own mind, done good, but wreaked havoc and caused massive amounts of violence. The Pol Pots of the world, or there's so many examples. Now, those are extreme examples, but they illustrate something very important, that until we really start to sort out identity, we can fool ourselves pretty easily. So that's why I really kind of take a singular approach to that first shift. And when I work with somebody in that phase of things, it's really kind of nice, because there's nothing to complicate. You don't need to overcomplicate anything. There's really nothing to see except who you are, who you really are. Who are you that's undeniable, right? Who are you that no thought, no doubt can threaten? I quoted Nisargadatta yesterday, and someone wrote a bit of a correction on how I quoted it, which is good. And so I looked him up, and he said it various ways of what his teacher told him to do. But they were all one or another version of, what you take yourself to be is not what you are. Find out what you are. That's it. That's what I'm pointing to. It's there's many ways to point to it, but there's only one undeniable knowing of you, for you, really. And I promise you it's there for everyone. So that's really the first big movement in this, endeavor. After that, often there's a honeymoon period that lasts a while, can last weeks, at least usually lasts weeks, often months. And then you get to this phase where it's kind of like, I had it, I lost it, or meing and being, profound presence intermixed with periods of intense emotions coming to the surface, and in a way that you hadn't quite felt before, because they're just so cless. Less filtering is possible. Hopefully, when that's happening, you feel a sort of responsibility to work with this. That's the key. Is be humble, be willing to have a teacher in some form or another, meaning don't convince yourself that you're done. That's not super common, but it does happen on occasion, and it can lead to some really strange things. Willingness to do the shadow work, willingness to see that this whole thing, even though from the beginning it seemed like it was there to make you feel better, we can't really use spirituality to make ourselves constantly feel better. It's just not going to work. That's not how nature is. And yet, suffering, there is something that is an unnecessary form of suffering that is still lingering, that is kind of in our face at times, which is good, so we can see it. We can get to the mechanism of it, see what it is we're doing to ourselves. That's, as again, Adyashanti says, look at how you're unenlightening yourself. But nature helps you figure this out. It shows you everything that you need to see. It shows you the emotions, the repression, the avoidance. And then it keeps showing you the uncaused, unearned, vast, beautiful presence. That it's just always there. So it's kind of this flip-flopping time that happens. And then things will calm down. A very good pointing even there is to rest in the sense of I am, because after awakening, the sense of I am, or the root of what that actually is clearly always available in one form or another. And so just resting in that as part of practice is very valuable. It will calm down a lot of the polarities in consciousness, the vasanas. And then at some point you can start to engage the very specific and singular perceptual filters that make up the, we'll say, the inauthentic self, the seeming separate self, the struggling self, the reactive self, the relational self, and the equanimity aspect really has to do with the reactive self, the one that's always struggling with moment-to-moment reality, and seeing clearly that it's not actually reality you're struggling with, it's your own version of reality, which is a made-up version of reality, which is the way it could be. So we make up a thing called the way it could be, and then we push and pull on it, and we convince ourselves it's the external world we're pushing and pulling on. And seeing that clearly one way or the other, until you realize there's no need to push and pull on it. It doesn't even work. All it does is stir the pot and confuse you. And then we start to come to a place where what is happening is also what I want to be happening. What I want to be happening doesn't have to be different than what actually is happening. It just seems like it does through habit. And with equanimity, things become much calmer. The up and down, and I had it, I lost it, and struggle, and the majority of the sense of suffering really can drop away with that. Then, most of the time, there is some remnants of dualistic experience remaining, meaning we perceive ourselves as a subject and the world as this space filled with objects. Objects being anything but I, anything but me, which is lovers, people, friends, family, material objects, events, and it starts to just become less and less meaningful, and just makes less sense to continue to reify a sense of a subject here that is somehow more important than all of that stuff out there. It just kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. Once the struggling subsides, you sort of see that the sense of the subject that always has to defend itself and make its world a better place because it's based on a sense of lack already, that was actually reinforced and almost to some degree created by the struggle. And when the struggle's not there, you realize, well, what's the point in defending this thing that was the result of so much, it was the result, but it was also the root of a lot of struggle. And then it's seen clearly that there's no more or less important aspect of experience. And specifically, that has to do with you. That what is right in front of your face, a flower, it has just as much significance as your own breath, as a tree, as the sky. In the absolute sense. In the relative sense, it's not like you stop eating or don't do things to take care of yourself. You will just do that naturally. But in the way we're taking our identity from experience, that heaviness falls out. And with that, there may or may not be any dualistic experience left. And if there is, then you can investigate the nature of the senses themselves and see if there's any boundary, if there are any boundaries anywhere. If there is any sort of subjective or subjectifying experience pulling back from sound or sensation or the visual field, smell or taste, and then even thought. Once we see that there's no ability to subjectify at all, there's no awareness apart from experience at all, then there's only the five senses, and thought is like another sense gate. And as I was talking with Violet this morning about, there's not even attention. Attention is an afterthought. This is hard to see for a long time, but at some point it's seen that even the seeming ability to move attention is itself only a thought. And with that, agency, doership, need to separate in any way to respond to an environment is just not there. And it never has been, just like the I am sense has always been there. It's realized that way. Later on, it's realized that all of the aspects and components of self that seemed important, the reactive self, the separate self, all of that, they literally were never there, which leaves, it's hard to say this, but it sort of leaves you to do nothing but be the enjoyer of the flow of phenomenon in the formlessness of it all. But there's not really a you apart from it. That's the funny thing about it. So it's just what's happening, just the flow of phenomenon, no trace enlightenment. There can also be a subtle self-sense hanging around, very, very subtle, the remaining sense of I am, perhaps. But often that takes care of itself at this point. And there's just the vivid phenomenal flow. And also, you could say it this way, there really is only the conventional now, just the conventional textures and forms and movements, events and so forth, but they are without substance, without any abiding existence in space or time. So you're free of time, you're free of distance, duality, space, and things get exquisitely simple, very, very simple, very innocent. And the realization, interestingly, still just carries itself forward spontaneously, requiring no effort. And then you can see that this is how it always was. Even though all the effort seemed to be there, and the person seemed to be there, and the duality seemed to be there, it actually never was. And it's a very funny joke at the end. It's an inside joke, and there's no one in on it. Okay, I think that's everything. Does anyone have any last comments, questions?